You're just here to clean, not to speak." The clipboard smacked against the polished boardroom table, the sound slicing through the hush like a slap, and in the same breath, a half-full coffee cup tipped, spilling dark liquid across the sleek glass before dripping slowly off the edge, splashing onto the janitor's shoes with quiet cruelty. No one reacted. No one helped. The room sat still, complicit in silence, some flicking their eyes away, others pretending not to notice at all. "Next time, know your place." She turned and walked off, heels clicking with confidence, never once glancing back. What she didn't know was that the woman she just humiliated, standing quietly in a deep burgundy janitor's jumpsuit, was the founder of the company, and today was the final day of her disguise. She moved quietly across the 47th floor, long before the executives arrived, long before anyone would glance her way, and then look straight through. The hallway lights reflected off the polished marble, and the only sound was the soft rhythm of her mop, soaking and sweeping, each stroke so practiced it almost disappeared. Her uniform was deep burgundy, clean but worn at the elbows, and on her chest was a plastic name tag that read Lena M. No one questioned what the M meant. No one cared. But behind that borrowed name and beneath that uniform stood Celeste Morgan, the real CEO of the very company whose floor she now cleaned. She hadn't always been invisible. Not so long ago, she was celebrated in places that mattered. Top of her class at Harvard, youngest associate to make partner at McKinsey, a strategist whose work had reshaped product teams across industries. But titles and resumes meant nothing here, now when they were buried under assumption and silence. The company, Elise Group, had been born in her father's garage in 1989, built with grit, caffeine, and code from a man who believed data should empower people, not bury them. She had grown up in its hallways, listened to her father's ideas take shape late into the night. But none of that mattered now, not in the way the boardroom regarded her, as the founder's daughter, not as the architect of anything new. Her father, Douglas Morgan, had slowed in recent years. Parkinson's came like a thief in fragments, stealing first his steady hands, then his words, then his presence. When he stepped down, they didn't hand her the reins. They handed her the illusion of power. She was invited to observe, not to decide. In meeting after meeting, her insights were repackaged by others and met with praise only when filtered through a different voice. Frustrated, she asked her father one night why she felt like a ghost in the company he built. He looked at her, faint smile, hands shaking, and said, "You've walked through this company, Celeste, but never through its bones. You know how it looked from above, but not how it feels underneath. You've never felt where people break. So what should I do?" she asked. He didn't hesitate. "Go down there. Now's my daughter, as one of them." And so she did. She called in a favor from a college friend who now ran a facilities vendor in Ridgeport. Within a week, her employee record was temporarily sealed, her access card disabled, and a generic badge issued under the name Lena. She chose the early morning shift, the quiet hours when power walked past without greeting. No assistant, no corner office, no privilege, just 2 weeks to live unnoticed, to feel the company without filter. She took her place in the service corridors, wiping down surfaces she once leaned against during press interviews, scrubbing floors beneath conference rooms that now locked her out. In elevators, she listened to whispers about diversity hires, heard laughter that curdled when her back was turned. She took note, not of people, but of patterns, not of names, but of silence. And though they didn't know her, and wouldn't remember her, she remembered everything. They didn't say it outright, not at first. No one told her she didn't belong, but it was in the pauses before they acknowledged her. In a way, her title was introduced with a shrug, and the glances passed over her shoulder like she was only half there. During her first month back, Celeste arrived to leadership meetings 15 minutes early, perfectly prepared, slides in order, ideas framed with data and market foresight. She spoke clearly, directly, with the confidence of someone who knew what she was doing. Yet somehow, after she presented, someone else would repeat her point. Less precise, less thoughtful, and the room would nod. That's exactly it, they'd say, as if she hadn't spoken at all. In one meeting, she proposed a bold initiative to recruit from historically black colleges. A senior VP chuckled and replied, "Let's focus on top talent first." No one flinched. She remembered sitting perfectly still, hands folded, jaw tight, heart flat. It wasn't just meetings. It was handshakes that lingered longer for others. It was smiles that dimmed when she entered. At an off-site dinner, a CFO leaned across the table and said, "Must be nice growing up with your last name. That's how to open a lot of doors." She smiled back, but inside, something cracked. These weren't accusations. They were dismissals, casual rejections dressed as compliments. Even when they tried to include her, they did it in ways that distanced her further. "You're such a powerful symbol," one director said during a panel. "It's inspiring just to have you on stage." They didn't mention her credentials, her experience, or the strategy she'd spent nights building. Just this symbol, as if she were decoration. The culture around her was polite, and that made it worse. There were no slurs, no raised voices, just soft exclusion. She'd walk into rooms and watch conversations shift. Jokes would stop mid-sentence. A marketing lead once introduced her as our legacy leader to a room full of interns, as though her only value was her bloodline. When she tried to challenge certain hiring patterns, why so few women of color advance beyond manager, the answer came back rehearsed. Pipeline issue. When she asked about pay disparities, she was told to wait until the next cycle, then the next. HR assured her they were looking into it. Always looking, never moving. But the hardest part wasn't the numbers, the silence, or the subtle sabotage. It was the slow erosion of certainty, that creeping doubt that maybe it wasn't them. Maybe it was her. Maybe she really was too much, too ambitious, too outspoken. Maybe she was imagining it all. That's how the system protected itself. Not through brute force, but by planting quiet seeds of self-erasure. She began shrinking herself without realizing, holding back in meetings, double-checking her tone in emails, rehearsing smiles that looked agreeable but not weak, firm but not aggressive. Every word she spoke was weighed against the fear of being seen as too, but still she watched. She documented. She remembered the names they praised and the names they forgot. She sat in the back of town halls and counted how many questions came from men who looked like the executives and how few were answered by people who looked like her. She said little, not because she lacked words, but because she was collecting them. This wasn't insecurity. It was clarity, because if she ever wanted to lead again, she couldn't just fix what was broken. She had to prove it had always been broken. And the only way to do that was to see it all and say nothing until it was time to speak with everything. It happened on a Tuesday, the kind of day no one would remember on a calendar, but one that etched itself into her memory with sharp, quiet finality. Celeste had been included on the invite for a quarterly leadership summit, one of those high-level strategy roundtables where real decisions got made behind smiles and status. She arrived early, as she always did, standing outside the glass-paneled heritage room on the 49th floor, notes in hand, sharp blazer pressed, prepared to make her case. But as she stepped inside, the conversation dulled. Heads turned, then quickly turned away. The lead facilitator glanced up and blinked. "Oh, Celeste, I wasn't sure you got the revised list. This session's mainly for operations today," he said, voice polite but firm. Eyes already moving on. There was no seat for her. Not one. She stood along the wall for 40 minutes, unnoticed. She listened as they spoke about reducing non-essential initiatives, about trimming community programs, about how brand image doesn't always equal bottom line. Someone even suggested sunsetting the Internal Equity Council, calling it a resource drain. No one pushed back. No one looked her way. And in that sterile room of tailored suits and folded arms, Something inside her broke, but not loudly. It was a silent, precise fracture. Not anger, not even humiliation, just clarity. A clean line between who she was and who they were willing to see. She wasn't leading. She was absorbing. She was buffering their discomfort, not shaping their direction. And that was over. She didn't return to her office. Instead, she walked past the C-suite elevators, down the side stairwell, through levels of the company most of them had never seen. She passed junior analysts chugging coffee over spreadsheets, interns scribbling notes in break rooms, contract cleaners unloading carts by the service lifts. As she moved down the building, the silence inside her grew louder, until she stopped at a hallway on the 20th floor and stared at a framed poster outside HR. It read, "Our people are our purpose." The irony hit like a whisper turn screen. She stood there, unmoving, and for a moment, she imagined tearing it off the wall, but didn't. She just walked on, deeper into the part of the building where no one asked what a CEO was doing without a name badge. That night, long after the building emptied, Celeste sat alone on an upside-down bucket in a janitor's closet behind a freight corridor, the light above flickering in tired rhythm. She took out her phone and called 3 people, each one a thread in the plan forming in her mind. One was a friend who now ran Ridgeport Janitorial Services. Another, a quiet legal advisor who could seal her employee records under privacy protections for executive burnout. The last was a vendor liaison with access to internal contractor scheduling. By midnight, her name was off the shift calendar. In its place, Lenam. No office, no elevator code, no attention, just gloves, rags, and silence. She wasn't going to fight the system from atop. She was going to walk into its blind spot and see everything it refused to show her when she walked through the front door. The final morning of her 2-week shift began like any other. Celeste, still Lena to everyone around her, clocked in at 5:42 a.m., her uniform crisp, her cart already loaded. She moved down the corridor with the same quiet rhythm, head slightly bowed, face unreadable, but something in her posture had changed. Still humble, still silent, but no longer invisible. As she wiped down the glass panel outside the executive boardroom, she caught a glimpse of her own reflection, just long enough to see the steadiness in her own eyes. Today was the day, and not because she needed recognition, but because it was time they saw what they'd refused to see. Inside the boardroom, the usual voices filled the air, overlapping, assertive, casually dismissive. They spoke about quarterly targets, about cost-cutting, about streamlining underutilized resources. No one noticed her standing just beyond the open doorway, not until a junior assistant hesitated, then whispered to the room, "I think someone's, trying to clean in here." There was laughter. One voice, familiar, called out, "Tell her we'll be done soon. Or better yet, get her to wipe the conference screen. It's been streaky all week." More chuckles. No one turned to look. She stepped inside. Not quickly, not dramatically, just calmly. She wheeled the cart past the projector screen, stopped near the far corner, and set the cloth neatly on the table. Then, without saying a word, she pulled a small envelope from the side pouch of the cart, placed it at the head of the table, and turned to leave. That's when one of the senior VPs frowned. "Hey, what's that?" Another asked, reaching for it. He opened it. Inside were 2 cards. One bore name, Celeste Morgan, Chief Executive Officer. The other was a formal memo, stamped and signed, outlining the reinstatement of full executive authority and the immediate termination of 3 overlapping advisory contracts. The room fell silent. Someone stood up. "This has to be a joke," but she didn't respond. She only turned back, standing taller now, and looked directly at the woman in the cream blazer, the same woman who had once slammed a clipboard, spilled coffee, and told her to know her place. That woman froze. Her mouth opened slightly, but no words came. Celeste held her gaze, not with anger, but with precision. "Calm, steady. You asked me to wipe the screen," she said, her voice low but firm. "But I'm here to make sure everyone in this room sees clearly." No shouting followed, no chaos, just the weight of realization settling across every face as silence took its place at the head of the table. Celeste didn't demand an apology. She didn't need one. Her presence did what words never could. It held a mirror to a system built on selective sight. She turned, pushed the cart out the door, and left them sitting in the truth they tried so hard not to see. The next morning, an all-hands meeting was announced without warning. It was rare for the CEO to speak directly to every employee. Rarer still for the invite to come without bullet points or slide decks. People filled the auditorium unsure what to expect, curious, cautious, carrying questions. When Celeste stepped on stage, she didn't wear a blazer or a pinstripe suit. She wore deep burgundy, the same color she had worn while cleaning their offices, wiping their tables, walking their halls unnoticed. She stood in front of them, no podium, no teleprompter, and for a long moment, she just looked at the crowd, not over them, into them. "I spent the last 2 weeks working among you, beside you, often beneath your line of sight," she began, her voice calm but clear. "Some of you held doors. Some of you didn't look twice. A few spoke to me kindly. A few mocked me without knowing. I didn't do this to test you. I did it because I needed to understand what kind of company we've really become." She paused, letting silence breathe, and I saw 2 Orleans groups, one that lives in our mission statements, and one that lives in our blind spots. I shifted in the audience, some uncomfortable, some locked in. What happens in the margins of this company isn't marginal, it's defining. Her words traveled beyond the auditorium. Clips were shared online, reshared, quoted. News outlets picked up the story of the CEO, who disguised herself as a janitor, not as a stunt, but as a reckoning. She met with teams across departments, not from behind a desk, but at eye level. She didn't just reinstate the Equity Council. She expanded it, gave it teeth, budget, and authority. She initiated blind review hiring in 2 departments and doubled the pipeline budget for underrepresented candidates. But more than that, she held listening sessions, not as a formality, but as an act of humility. She said one thing again and again: power means nothing if it only listens to itself. And the weeks that followed, something shifted. Not everything. Culture doesn't change on command, but the silence cracked. People began speaking up, not because they were told to, but because they believed someone might actually listen. The woman in the cream blazer resigned quietly. Others stayed, but with different eyes. And Celeste, she didn't ask for applause. She didn't post long reflections. She just kept showing up in the elevator, in the break room, in the spaces where leadership usually doesn't go. Because for her, this wasn't about proving she was capable. It was about proving the system could be better.